Good evening and welcome to the 8th, or it might be the 9th session in our series on Greek history and civilization, about 700 BC to about 500 AD, and I will get to 500 AD next week. I don't know how I'll get there, but I will do it. A forced march, perhaps. But today I want to talk about the Hellenistic Age. And the first thing I want to say about this is that until about 100 years ago, and you might even see it still reflected in some of the modern popular literature, it was believed that the great age of Greece came to an end with the death of Alexander the Great. Until then, you had the independence of the Greek city-states and principally the flourishing of Athens. With the death of Alexander, this of course comes to an end, and from then on Greece is dominated by great kingdoms, great absolute despotisms. You have Ptolemaic Egypt, Seleucid Syria, you have Macedon in the north of Greece, and this is seen as something of a decline from the glorious days of classical Greece. Indeed, until the early 20th century, the study of Greek literature ended with Demosthenes, who died a few years after Alexander the Great. There was no attention paid to Greek literature after that time because it was all second-rate and derivative. More recently, we've come to a much more balanced view of what is called the Hellenistic Age. And to define our terms, the Hellenistic Age runs from the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BC, and it's brought to a very artificial end in 30 BC, when Octavian became the Pharaoh of Egypt following the death of Cleopatra, and you then have undisputed and unbroken control of Rome over the whole of the eastern Mediterranean, though in truth what you could call the Hellenistic Age continued all the way down to the establishment of Christianity in the 4th century AD. It might even have continued all the way down to the Islamic conquest. But whatever the case, the Hellenistic Age is the post-classical age of Greece. And this is not a time of decline. It's not a time of falling off from the glories of the classical age. Undoubtedly, you don't have that flashbulb civilization which was classical Greece, this great burst of light that goes off in the darkness, and you stand dazzled by its glow even after it's passed. But that's not to say that Greek civilization became particularly dark. It continued at a very high burn for century after century after century, and remained vigorous enough indeed eventually to absorb Roman civilization into itself, so that at last the Greeks actually took over the Roman Empire. So I want to talk about the early centuries of the Hellenistic Age, the period from about the death of Alexander down to about 100 BC. And we'll start by looking at this cover slide. This is the hermaphrodite, the sleeping hermaphrodite. The bed, by the way, is not original. That's by Bernini. And apparently when people look at this in the Louvre, it's necessary to hold them back because people cannot resist the urge to give a poke to that mattress to see if it is really made of marble or if it is indeed an actual bed. But the statue itself is a 2nd century statue made somewhere in Asia Minor, we're not quite sure where. It was found, I believe, in the baths of Diocletian in Rome in the 1620s, and Bernini was commissioned to produce a bed for it. Now this is a fine example of post-classical Greek sculpture. If anybody wants to say that there is anything at all second-rate about this, well, perhaps your knowledge of art is rather more sophisticated than mine. This looks perfectly good. Indeed, it doesn't look perfectly good. It is a masterpiece, isn't it? And bear in mind that at the time this would have been painted, it would have looked much more lifelike. Greek statues were not chaste and white. They were brightly coloured. And if you take yourself to the Acropolis Museum in Athens, you'll see casts of the statues covered in bright paint. If you take yourself to the Archaeological Museum in Cambridge, you'll see the same. So you're seeing this not as it was originally shown to the public. Oh, and there is the other side, which I suppose one might say shows a decidedly modern cast of mind for the Greeks. So it is the sleeping Hermaphrodite from about 150 BC. What I would say in general is that the Hellenistic age was a time of immense intellectual and political and general artistic achievement among the Greeks. It is not a falling off from the glories of the classical age. It is a continuation of the classical age, and it went on for century after century. And you can even take the Christian literature from the 1st century AD as an example of Hellenistic literature. And again, until recently, there were people who insisted that the Greek of the New Testament and of the Church Fathers is somehow inferior. But I do teach a course on Thursday morning in New Testament Greek, and we're all agreed that the Greek of people like St. Luke and St. John is just as good, though in a different way, as the Greek of Plato and Thucydides. It does its job just as well. I would say that the Hellenistic age is not to be despised. It's not something you hurry over as you pass from the classical age of Greece to the Roman hegemony and the classical age of Latin literature, from Cicero to Tacitus or something. It is an age of greatness in itself. But let us make a start with this. Now, Alexander died on the 10th of June 323 BC. He was only 33, and we don't know exactly what did carry him off. He may have died from cholera, he may have died from alcohol poisoning, he may have died of an infection from an unhealed arrow wound, or he may have been poisoned by his own generals because he'd started to behave like one of the more unbalanced Roman emperors, and they were frightened of him. Because he was so young when he died, he didn't leave a successor. On his deathbed, he was asked, who gets the empire? And his answer apparently was the best or the strongest, depends how you understand the Greek word. But once he was dead, that was it. The generals retired from the death room, and they spent 5 days arguing over who would get what. In the meantime, the body was left in the deathbed. Eventually, the Egyptian embalmers were allowed in, and there is a rather fanciful representation of Egyptian embalming. And it's not that fanciful. My artificial intelligence generated images are often very good, and that is roughly how people were embalmed. You lay the body out, you cut it open, you take out all the guts, and then you stick it for 40 days in some drying fluid. Alexander was not embalmed in that way. Instead, his entire body was placed in a vat of honey, where it remained for many centuries. But Alexander was dead, and the question was, what is going to happen next? He's conquered this vast empire, and he's transformed the Greek world. Here is a map showing the Greek world as it was around 700 BC, and this is the Greek world as it was until Alexander's conquests. You have an impressively large number of Greek settlements around the Mediterranean, but apart from the mainland of Greece and apart from southern Italy, the Greeks are a marginal people controlling coastal areas, indeed maybe not even controlling much of those. The Greeks were present in city-states here and there, and they were in continual danger of conquest by the Persians or of raids from the barbarians across the Danube. Or, in Egypt, they existed on the sufferance of the local political authorities. By the time Alexander died, the Greeks were the dominant people of the Eastern Mediterranean, and their domination stretched deep into Central Asia, all the way down to India and almost up to the boundaries of China. This is a total transformation of the status of the Greeks, a transformation of the status of the Greek language and of Greek civilization, and a completely unexpected transformation. But it was a very rapidly achieved transformation, and with Alexander's death, the obvious question was, what next? Who is going to take over this great empire? The initial answer was that the empire would be held together, but Alexander's generals, his more senior generals, would rule parts of the empire as some kind of committee. That didn't work out very well, as you can well understand. What actually happened was there was a desperate scramble, and everybody tried to get whatever he could. Within a year of his death, certainly within 10 years of his death, the empire had broken up. The main winners of this were Antipater in Greece and Macedon, Seleucus in Syria and the East, and Ptolemy in Egypt. These were all Macedonian generals. They were all either his school friends or his father's people, and they are the big winners of the scramble for territory and for status. Oh, and there's a nice 15th century English representation of the death of Alexander. You'll see he's got a fire burning in the grate to keep him warm, even though it is in Babylon in June, and he's sitting propped up in bed, dictating his will to a notary who is on his left-hand side. That is an even more fanciful representation than something I could produce with my artificial intelligence engine. Now, this is what happened. This is not the final shape, but this is the interim shape of the post-Alexander world. And I want to look through these parts in some detail. To the north, you have the Kingdom of Macedonia. This is the poorest and the smallest of the successor kingdoms, of the great successor kingdoms. Even so, Macedonia has gold mines, it has a great deal of fertile country, it has a large population, and Macedonia is able to dominate the whole of Greece. It's able to dominate the Greek city-states to the south, even though they are not formally part of the Kingdom of Macedon. To the south, you have that yellow area, the Ptolemaic Kingdom of Egypt. And notice that the Ptolemaic Kingdom includes the whole of what is now Israel and a large part of Lebanon. It includes Tyre but not Sidon, and it includes the Dead Sea. That's it. It also has Cyprus, and for a while it has the southern shores of Asia Minor. It has Caria, Lycia, and the southern part of Pamphylia. And this is one of the big winners of the scramble for territory after Alexander's death. You then have this huge expanse of the Seleucid Empire. It looks magnificent on paper. Most of this is desert, and most of it is rather notionally ruled. But it does contain the Tigris and Euphrates, and these have large and wealthy populations. It also contains Mesopotamia and Syria was very soon the main part of this empire. Indeed, it was ruled from Seleucia on the Mediterranean coast, or sometimes from Antioch, new foundations, Greek cities. So this is Alexander's empire as broken up. I won't talk about the kingdom of Armenia and the kingdom of Pontus. Those can go by default. So this is the shape of the world after Alexander, and in all of these territories, the Greeks are the dominant people. They're not the majority in most of these areas, but they are the dominant people, and you'll find that inscriptions, statues, coins, and other physical artifacts from this period are generally in Greek. So this is the new Greek world. It's no longer a cluster of city-states in southern Greece and on the western coast of Asia Minor. It's no longer even very wealthy territories in southern Italy and Sicily and further west in southern France. It's now this vast area in the east in which the Greeks are culturally and politically the dominant people. For the next few hundred years, indeed for the next 1,000 years in Egypt, the Greeks will be the rulers, even if in Egypt they have to share that domination with the Romans after a while. So let's begin with Macedon. This is where it all started. This is the kingdom of Philip, the kingdom of Alexander. Macedon does not have a particularly happy history. It doesn't have a fortunate history in its political sense. I've given you a complete slide here which gives you a timeline of events in Macedon. As soon as Alexander was dead, his half-brother Philip III Aridaeus became the king of Macedon. He ruled together with Olympias, the mother of Alexander. Although she may have tried to poison him in the past, she found that her present interest lay in working with him. However, Philip Aridaeus was murdered within 6 years. One of Alexander's sons, by a wife called Roxana, an Asian woman, was then brought in as an infant king, and Olympias ruled as his regent. He lasted from 323 to 309, and he was eventually murdered, as was the mother of Alexander. I believe they were both stoned to death together. After that, Cassander ruled. He had been one of Alexander's generals, and he was a strong and ruthless ruler of Macedon. Indeed, he was able to dominate the Greek city-states to the south, and he's the man who decided that Demosthenes, the great leader of the Athenian assembly, was troublesome, and he sent men down to kill Demosthenes, and Demosthenes had to retire to a temple for sanctuary, and he eventually killed himself rather than be taken prisoner, dragged off north to Pella, the Macedonian capital, and possibly tortured to death. After Cassander, you have 2 further successors. You then, from the beginning of the 3rd century BC, have a new family, Demetrius I, the besieger. Eventually, you have another family taking over in Macedon. For a while, these made Macedon the great power in Greece and even a great power in the eastern Mediterranean, but they overreached themselves. From the time of Philip V, starting in 221 BC, the Macedonians found themselves in conflict with the Romans, which was probably not the wisest thing to do. The Romans marched into the Balkan Peninsula and they took out Macedonia. The Romans didn't want to conquer Macedonia, but they found they had no choice, and having conquered Macedonia, they thought they might as well take over the Greek city-states to the south, and from 146 BC, there was no more Kingdom of Macedon, and there were no more independent Greek city-states. The whole area had been partitioned into the Roman province of Macedonia and the Roman province of Achaia to the south, and that was the end of Greek independence. So that is what happened in Macedon. But as I said, although it's a rather sad political history, Macedon continued to be a wealthy and a rather heavily populated area, and so whoever ruled Macedon was a great man in the Greek world. and the fact that he could exercise a loose and occasional dominion over the Greek city-states gave him a great deal of prestige. So that is Macedon. You then have the Seleucid Empire, that vast area of Western and Central Asia, stretching from the eastern shores of the Mediterranean all the way down deep into India. And this has a mixed history. I've given a fairly complete timeline. The fact that it's a fairly complete timeline, and it's rather a long timeline, indicates that the Seleucid kingdom did not enjoy total success and was hardly ever at peace. There were continual wars with neighbours, there were continual losses and gains of territory. The empire had no natural frontiers, and there were continual internal disturbances, civil wars, poisonings, all that sort of thing. Demetrius II, his second reign, 129 to 125 BC, he is followed by a rival king, Alexander II Zabinas, a complete usurper. He is then defeated by Seleucus V, who ruled for about a year. He ruled very briefly. He was probably ruling in association with his mother, Cleopatra Thea, a daughter of one of the kings of Egypt. She appears to have poisoned him and replaced him with her younger son, Antiochus IX. He ruled with some success, and he appears also to have put his mother to death by poisoning her. So what you have is a fragmented and unstable history of this empire. Sometimes it pulled itself together and became big and powerful, particularly under kings like Antiochus III, who was a very big and important man until he got into an argument with the Romans, and as usual with the Romans, he came off very badly. It was a wealthy territory. It was a large territory with some very dense populations in some places, large and magnificent cities, a very important set of cultural centres like Antioch and Pergamon, and even Babylon. It was an interesting place, but not always a very successful place. We don't know as much about it as we'd like to, because much of the evidence has disappeared, and what we have is fragmentary mentions in later historians. But we then come to the successor kingdom, of which we know most, and which was by far the most successful. In 323 BC, Ptolemy, an old school friend of Alexander from Macedon and one of his generals, I think he was the commander of Alexander's cavalry, was told, or was allowed, to take himself off to Alexandria as not the king of Egypt, no, that followed somewhat later, as a ruler of Egypt in place of Alexander. It seems that Ptolemy turned up in Alexandria, which was still building at the time, in 323. He called the senior Greeks in the city to himself. He also called any senior Egyptians who could be brought in, and he put to them a deal. What he said to them was, Alexander is dead, his empire is about to disintegrate into chaos and civil war. I'm the only man who can keep Egypt safe, and so you will do exactly as I say. The Greeks agreed, the Egyptians agreed, and Ptolemy became the ruler of Egypt. 18 years later, when his feet were well and truly under the table, Ptolemy dropped the pretense of ruling Egypt as the representative of the dead Alexander. He instead had himself crowned Pharaoh of Egypt at Memphis, and his family then ruled Egypt all the way down to 30 BC, when his last descendant, Cleopatra, committed suicide. And this was several hundred years of great success and great wealth for Egypt and for the Greeks who settled in Egypt. Ptolemy and his successors ruled the country in two ways. In Alexandria, Ptolemy was the king. He was like the king of Macedon, for example. He showed himself to the Greeks as a Greek king. And this was the case in Alexandria and in all the other cities in the north where the Greeks were dominant. In those areas of Egypt where the Greeks were not dominant, Ptolemy showed himself to the people as a traditional pharaoh. And here are two representations of Ptolemy I. There is a statue, as he liked to show himself to his Greek-speaking subjects in Egypt, and there is a representation of Ptolemy from a temple wall. He is portrayed in the traditional manner of an Egyptian pharaoh, and he is making a traditional offering to the traditional Egyptian gods. So the Ptolemies ruled Egypt with two faces. There was the face they showed to their Greek-speaking subjects, and there was the face they showed to their Egyptian-speaking subjects. And for nearly 300 years, the Ptolemies, the family of Ptolemy, ruled Egypt with complete success. Not always the same success as each other. Some were more successful, some were less successful, but they were, on the whole, very successful. They put Egypt through a period of rapid economic development. It doesn't compare with the rapid economic development of the past 4 centuries, but Egypt became a great trading power in the Eastern Mediterranean. It became the richest and most powerful state in the Eastern Mediterranean, and Alexandria soon became the meeting point of East and West. I will show this. There we are, there is a map. The capital of this new Egypt was not Memphis along the Nile. It wasn't Thebes. It was none of the traditional capitals of ancient Egypt. It was instead Alexandria, the new city on the northern coast of the country, which had been laid out by Alexander. And Alexandria became, for a time, the biggest city in the Mediterranean world. It had at its height a population of about 750,000. It rivaled Antioch, it outclassed Antioch. It was eventually overshadowed only by Rome, where the population eventually rose to about 1 million. But whereas Rome was a city of consumption, Rome was a place to which wagons came crowded with goods and then went away empty, Alexandria was at all times a commercial city. The ships that brought things to Alexandria went away filled with things that had been made in Alexandria. This map on the right doesn't show the canal, but there was a canal built from one of the streams of the Nile Delta here at Hierapolis down to Arsinoe here on the Red Sea, which meant that it was possible to load a ship in Alexandria with glassware or leatherware or other things made in Alexandria, to send it along the Nile Delta and then through a series of canals to here, and then from here to go in a wide canal straight across the desert to the Red Sea, from where the ship would proceed down the Red Sea into the Indian Ocean and would find its way to Ceylon and even perhaps to Canton and Shanghai in China. We know this because Alexandrian glassware has been found in quite large quantities in China, in the coastal cities, and I believe Alexandrian glassware has also been found in various royal tombs of this period from Korea. So Alexandria is in touch with India and the Far East. Alexandria sends all the goods of the Mediterranean world, and particularly glassware made in Alexandria, east, and in return it brings to the west silk and spice and other things from the east. So Alexandria becomes an immensely wealthy and an immensely important commercial city in the Mediterranean. It is the early equivalent of Venice in the Middle Ages, and it is ruled by Ptolemy and by his successors. There are various maps of Alexandria. One of the glories of Alexandria, and there were many, was the lighthouse. Let's find it. There is, again, a rather fanciful representation of the lighthouse produced by my artificial intelligence engine. It was the first substantial lighthouse ever built. It was 450 feet tall, and it was fed with oil and other flammable materials so that at night it would send out a beam of light 50 miles north into the Mediterranean, which meant that ships could come and go at all hours of the day and night. The lighthouse was built from glass bricks. The architect was told by Ptolemy, whichever King Ptolemy it was, I think it was King Ptolemy II Philadelphus, but it doesn't matter. He was told by one of the Ptolemies, I want a lighthouse and I want it to last. And so the architect threw various materials into the Mediterranean and watched them dissolve over the course of about 5 years. He rejected all the stones he tried, he rejected ordinary brick, but he found that glass didn't dissolve in the seawater, so he had millions of bricks made from glass. The lighthouse was built from glass bricks, and it continued to exist until about 1200 AD, when whoever was ruling Egypt at the time was told that there might be a great treasure buried in the foundations of the lighthouse, so he had it demolished. Didn't find a treasure, but that was the end of the Lighthouse of Alexandria. There's another representation of Alexandria, an enormous city filled with vast and magnificent buildings and with a population that reached about 750,000 people. Wide streets crowded with merchants and with wealthy people walking around for their exercise or walking about their various kinds of commercial business. A new kind of city in the Greek world. The Greeks had never had a city of this kind, never a city on this scale, never a city this wealthy or this powerful. Now, I spoke about this before we started the session, but I'll repeat it. The natural tendency of cities before about 1850 was for them to be net consumers of humanity. City dwellers never had enough children to replace themselves. They never had enough children because their birth rate was lower than in the countryside, and also because cities were very unhealthy places, and so a city cut off from the countryside would very soon run out of people. A city would last for about 5 generations, dwindling throughout that time unless continually replenished. When you call Alexandria a Greek city, or when you call Antioch a Greek city, we are not after a while talking about a city populated by Greeks who could trace their ancestry back to Athens or Corinth or Thessaly or even Macedonia. We're talking about people you can call cultural Greeks. What happens is that if you have a city like Alexandria, which is absolutely dominated by the Greeks, in order to be of any importance in the city, you must be a Greek. It means that if you decide to come into Alexandria from the countryside, you're a native Egyptian, you don't know any Greek, you decide to try your luck in Alexandria, you sell sausages or you make sandals or something, you're rather successful. You will have to learn Greek in order to deal with your wealthier clients, but you will speak Greek rather badly. But you'll make sure that your sons are sent to a school to get a decent education so that they're fluent in Greek, rather like St. Paul of Tarsus. St. Paul was a Jew. He didn't think in Greek, as far as I can tell, but his family was rather well-to-do, and Paul was sent off to a school, and he had a thorough grounding in Greek and the Greek classics, so well that he was able to give a very good speech in Athens on the Areopagus Hill. So your sons become Greek speakers. They become culturally Greek in the same way as St. Paul was a cultural Greek. Their sons no longer speak Coptic. They no longer speak the native language of the Egyptian countryside. They are simply Greeks. So you have a continual wash through of immigrants from the country districts who over the course of 3 generations become completely assimilated to the civilization of the city, which in this case is Greek. After 4 or 5 generations, the family dies out, but it's replaced by other people who go through the same process. So these cities were founded and in the first instance settled by Greeks, but after a few generations, the Greek-speaking populations were not genetically Greek. They were the descendants of local people who'd moved to the city and learned Greek. This meant that the Greek-speaking population of the Mediterranean could expand rapidly and could expand far beyond the numbers of Greeks that you see in the 5th and 4th centuries BC. It was a civilization maintained by continual absorption and assimilation. It doesn't mean that these new Greeks wiped themselves completely clean of their pre-existing culture. And going back to the example of St. Paul, in Athens, Paul could stand up and make a thoroughly decent speech that got all the philosophers thinking and saying, "Oh, we'll hear more of this when you have a moment." He spoke Greek without any foreign accent, and he could turn out a very fine passage in Greek if you read his letters to the Corinthians and the Romans. But it doesn't mean that Paul was a Greek. He was a Jew, and he accepted the entire culture of his ancestors, or at least he accepted a large part of it. St. Paul is perhaps not the best example, but you could have people like Philo of Alexandria, a Greek-speaking Jew who was one of the great writers of the 1st century AD in Greek. He was entirely Greek in his civilization, except that he was also a practicing Jew. So these new Greeks didn't abandon their old ways. What they did was over several generations to create a new kind of hybrid civilization, which was Greek in some respects and something else in other respects. They brought new religious and cultural and linguistic impulses into the Greek world. Eventually, of course, they brought in Christianity, but before then they brought in the cult of Isis, they brought in the cult of Mithras, the cult of Attis, a thoroughly strange religion if you ask me, and they brought in new ways of speaking. There were profound changes in spoken Greek, which again we see reflected in the Greek of the New Testament. It doesn't mean that the Greek of the New Testament is in any sense inferior to that of the Athenian classics. It is different. It's different in the simplification of grammar, the regularization of verb and noun forms, and it was also very different in its pronunciation. There was a long rearguard action fought by Greek scholars to try to get people who'd learned Greek to pronounce it, to their view, correctly. And that's where you get the Greek accents. Those accents were made up. They were devised by a man called Aristophanes of Byzantium as a means of telling new speakers of the language how the words were to be pronounced. Not enormously successful because we're still arguing over what the accents indicated, but never mind that. And so here are the Greeks of Egypt. Some of them do look very Greek. That man on the left, he could be a Greek, a native Greek. His ancestors may have come from Corinth or perhaps not. These two people in the centre and on the right, they're probably rather more exotic than Greeks, aren't they? They're native Egyptians whose families have turned Greek. I've spoken about a hybrid civilization. These are people who dressed as Greeks. These are people who spoke Greek, but when they died, they didn't have their bodies cremated in the Greek way. They were mummified in the Egyptian way, and the Egyptian custom was to attach a portrait to the mummy case. These are mummy case portraits from Fayum in Egypt. Many of these are in the British Museum if you want to go and look at them. So these are the mummy portraits of people who've been embalmed in the traditional Egyptian manner, which means that they believed in the Egyptian religion. They believed that Isis would guide them into the underworld, and the underworld would be very like the underworld shown on the wall paintings in ancient Egyptian tombs. But they are Greek speakers, and they dress like Greeks, they have the hairstyles of Greeks, and when they have their mummy portraits fixed to the case, they use Greek artists using Greek artistic conventions. So this is what I mean by the hybrid civilization of the new Greek East. It's not the case that the Greeks imposed their own civilization and their own values on the new subject peoples and turned some of them into identikit Greeks who might have got by very well on the streets of Athens. No, there was a merging of Greek and other civilizations. We can see this most clearly in Egypt because the archaeology has allowed us to see it in much more detail than elsewhere. But something like this happened far to the east in India, where the Greek-speaking rulers of those cities left behind by Alexander very soon converted to Buddhism. And you see something like this going on in Syria and in Mesopotamia. Oh, there's two other paintings. That from the left, that is of Artemidorus, who may have been Greek or he may have been Egyptian, but you see, it's an irrelevant question as to what he was. He was a Greek. He was an Egyptian Greek. Whether his family originated in Egypt and had turned Greek, or whether he was a descendant of Greek settlers, or whether he was a mixed descendant of Greek settlers and Hellenized Egyptians, is not something we can easily answer. It's also something of probably zero importance. If you'd asked Artemidorus when he was alive, what is your nationality, he'd probably have said Greek, and I suppose that must be as good as it gets. Now, he was a rather unfortunate young man. He was about 19 in 100 AD when he died of a fatal blow to the back of his head. His family was rather well-to-do. They had him mummified, and there is his mummy. You can see it in the British Museum, though it's now placed at an angle that makes photographing it and even looking at it rather difficult. It used to be standing up in the British Museum, so you could go and look straight into his face. Nowadays you have to bend and squint and hope that all the other tourists get out of your way. But there he is. There is young Artemidorus, mummified in the Egyptian manner, sent into the underworld in the traditional Egyptian way, but there he is as he was in life, a Greek, wearing Greek clothes, clean-shaven, wearing a Greek wreath around his head. And if I'd reproduced enough of the photograph, you'd have had a Greek farewell just above his breast. Artemidore eupsuche. Farewell, Artemidorus. On the right, that's rather more interesting, or it's equally interesting. There you have a Greek. He's wearing Greek clothes. He's holding a Greek book in his hands, and he's being guided into the underworld by the Egyptian god Anubis, and that may well be the goddess Isis on his right-hand side, there to protect him on his journey into the underworld. So this is part of this new and enormously wealthy and vibrant civilization or set of civilizations which grow up in the Greek East after the death of Alexander. And to say that this is in any way inferior to Greece of the classical period is to take a very impoverished view of the matter. It is an extension of classical Greece. It's not a decline from classical Greece. It is a new kind of Greece, but it is still Greece. This map shows the spread of the Greek language. These are the Greek-speaking areas as they were around 100 BC. It's not an entirely reliable map because, of course, when you don't have figures, when you don't have statistics from the period, everything is rather conjectural. The dark blue areas are those where Greek is believed to have been the absolutely dominant language, where nearly everybody spoke it. You could walk through the gates of a city, and in the country districts, people would answer you in Greek because that was their native language. The lighter blue areas are those where Greek was very widely understood, spoken in the cities, and would be understood in many of the country districts. You can see that the absolute dominance of Greek in Egypt is confined to Alexandria and a rather large strip along the shores of the Mediterranean. You can see that in Syria, the area of total Greek dominance is from Tyre and Sidon upwards to about Antioch. And then you have a great extension of Greek from beyond the Ionian city-states on the western coast of Asia Minor, deep inland. And then you have these dots in the east. Those are rather large Greek-speaking cities, but they are in areas where the country people do not speak Greek. You have similar extensions of Greek into North Africa and, of course, in southern Italy and in Sicily. This wouldn't change very much over the next 600 years or so. Greek would begin to disappear from southern Italy during the Roman period because more and more people would move over to Latin. In the Balkans, Greek would give way in the east to Latin. Illyria, by about the 6th century, was a Latin-speaking area. However, Greek would expand further and further north towards the Danube, and during the Byzantine period, which is far outside our time, the whole of what is now Turkey would have been Greek-speaking, and this is an achievement of the Greek Orthodox Church. Although Egypt was taken by the Arabs in the 7th century, Greek remained a very important language in Egypt. Why, I think the last Greeks were expelled from Egypt in 1967. Until then, about a quarter of the population of Alexandria had been Greek. So this expansion of Greek is something that goes on, and it continues with expansions and contractions. Why, for the next 2,000 years? Indeed, until the early 20th century, much of what is now Western Turkey was filled with Greek speakers, and until the 1950s, about a third of the population of Istanbul was native Greek speakers. And this is the long-term effect of Alexander's conquests. And as I said, these people could not, even if the documentation existed, which it never has, but these people would not have been able to trace their bloodlines back to the contemporaries of Socrates and Plato and Demosthenes. They were the descendants of people who had become Greeks and who had brought into Greek civilization many of the ways and assumptions of their own civilizations, which then had a general influence on Greek civilization and Greek thought throughout the whole of the Greek-speaking world. Economic progress and decline. I've said something of this. Under the Ptolemies, Egypt went through several years of intensive economic development, becoming much richer than it had been under the pharaohs. Egypt provides the whole Mediterranean with a vast amount of corn and other foodstuffs every year. It is the main glass-making centre for the entire planet. It provides the Mediterranean and the Near East with papyrus and linen. It also exports a large amount of beer. It's also the point of contact, at least Alexandria is, with sub-Saharan Africa and with the Far East. So you go to Alexandria to buy ivory, to buy incense, to buy silk, to buy whatever you want. And Alexandria, because of this early version of the Suez Canal, is in close contact by sea with the Far East. The Seleucid Empire, not really a sea-based empire, but the Silk Road runs through the Seleucid Empire. So again, a great deal of silk and other stuff from the east is brought along these trade routes into the Mediterranean world. The entirety of the Mediterranean is stitched together by these conquests of Alexander and by the opening up of trade routes. This is balanced by economic decline in mainland Greece, but that is something that happens slowly and is much more than offset by the immense economic progress in the new Greek areas. These new cities very quickly outclassed the traditional Greek cities. Here is a representation of Athens by a friend of mine, Dimitris Tsalkanis. He's produced, and I've given you the link to it, he's produced a series of 3D representations of Athens as it may have appeared at various times in its history. He does archaic Greece, classical Greece, Hellenistic Greece, Roman Greece, Byzantine Greece, and Ottoman Greece. The boundaries between these periods are, of course, artificial, but they're interesting reconstructions of Athens as it was at various times in its history. And this is probably a fair representation of Athens as it appeared around 250 BC. We can all agree, oh, Athens, to see the buildings on the Acropolis when they were still fresh and entire must be a glorious thing. And yes, Athens was a wonderful place, and it was filled with students from all over the Greek world, and eventually it was filled with young Romans as well, who all flocked to Athens to enroll themselves in the philosophical and literary schools to complete their education. So Athens becomes increasingly a university city, but it's also a small city, and it's not a tremendously rich city. If you are a Greek who wants to see the world, if you're a Greek who wants to make something of yourself, you do not necessarily go to Athens, you don't even go to Corinth. Increasingly, these cities take second place behind the vast cities that are growing up after the death of Alexander. And there again is one representation of Alexandria with its lighthouse, and there is another, the wide and very long streets of central Alexandria, lined with buildings of the utmost magnificence, their streets filled with all the riches of the East and all the riches of Alexandria, filled with people of every race, every colour, speaking every conceivable language, all there to do business with each other and to make money. I'll also say that it was a tremendously violent place because the native Egyptians hated the Greeks hated the native Egyptians, both hated the Jews, and the Jews hated the Egyptians and the Greeks, and it was necessary to maintain a very large army in Alexandria to keep the peace. And the Romans, when they took over Egypt, found that they had to maintain a large army outside Alexandria to stop the continual rioting. In some of these riots, you could get 30,000 people killed, so I wouldn't call Alexandria exactly utopia. But most of the time, people weren't rioting against each other. Most of the time, they were doing business, and it was right up until the time of the Arab conquest, and for some time beyond that, an immensely wealthy city. Turning to other cultural matters, it is not at all the case that the great age of Greek literature ended with the death of Alexander the Great, but you do get a different kind of Greek literature, and this is, I suppose, a different kind of Greek literature. The cultural centre of Greece shifted from Athens to Alexandria. If I can go forward, Ptolemy the first King Ptolemy, was a man of great ability. He wrote the standard biography of Alexander. Unfortunately, the biography is lost, but it was used by all subsequent biographers and were able to say that it was a thoroughly sound piece of scholarship. And Ptolemy also established the library in Alexandria. This was immensely expanded by his son Ptolemy II. It turns into the ancient equivalent of a university plus library plus research institute. This became the cultural heartland of the Greek world. The library at Alexandria soon had over 1 million books. It's not just a repository filled with papyrus scrolls. It is presided over by scholars of considerable genius. It's thanks to the Alexandrian scholars that we have the standard texts that we have of the Greek classics and of the Homeric poems. They set about purging these texts of whatever corruptions had been introduced into them. They produced standard scholarly editions from which we still benefit. Indeed, if you look at any commentary of Homer, you'll see continual references to writers like Eratosthenes, for example, or Aristarchus, who had suggested particular reconstructions. So this was a vast library and a vast university. There was also a very important medical school in Alexandria. The Ptolemies gave the doctors criminals, condemned criminals, to dissect, and it seems that the doctors in Alexandria discovered all sorts of things about the human body that no one had ever found before. Things like the circulation of the blood and the function of the lymph glands. Things that were eventually forgotten and that needed to be rediscovered in the 17th and 18th centuries. There on the right is a sheet of papyrus from a standard Greek book. For obvious reasons, most of the literature, most of the complete sheets of papyrus we have from Egypt are Christian, and this is from St. Paul's second letter to the Corinthians. So this is one of the Greek texts that you'd have seen in Alexandria, and there is a representation of the library in Alexandria. That's one of the main reading rooms. The cultural heart of Greek civilization moves from Athens to Alexandria, where it remains for many centuries. So I'll say again, this is not an age of decline. It's not an age devoid of genius. You have great mathematicians, you have great writers, you have great scientists, you have people who are developing everything that had been established in the classical period of Greek civilization. It's not the same, but it is not a noticeable decay of Greek civilization, and it's not at all a noticeable decay of Greek artistic standards. Let's look at this. This is a Hellenistic statue. It's a drunken old woman. What you can say about this is that nothing like this would have been produced in Athens during the classical period, because the classical Greeks were interested in ideal standards of beauty. They were not tremendously interested in realistic representations. The Hellenistic Greeks, though, were interested in individual representations. So you see this drunken old woman sitting with a wine jar on her lap. She's got her head pushed up and she's probably singing to herself, and she's old and ugly and broken down, but it's a very fine piece of art. It's just that it's different from the kind of sculptors that would once have been on the Acropolis. Any Greek artist of the 5th and 4th century BC looking at this would have turned from it with disgust, saying, technically very polished, I'll grant you, but it's not a good use of marble. Whereas the later Greeks decided that this was a good use of marble, and it's really up to you to decide whether it was or wasn't a good use of marble. So there is an increasing focus on the human and on individual characteristics, not even stopping at ugliness and grotesquerie. But at the same time, you do have a greater focus on individuality. There is a statue, the Dying Gaul. I think that's in the Capitoline Museum. Indeed, it is in the Capitoline Museum. My own photograph of it, taken some years ago, was not as good as this, so I borrowed one from Wikimedia. Greece and Asia Minor were invaded in the 2nd century BC by the Gauls from across the Danube, and they were fought off with great tenacity. And there is a representation of one of the Gallic barbarians who has been killed, and he's dying. Again, the Greeks never passed up at any time in their history the opportunity to show a bit of naked flesh, but there you have it. Or you have that, a very famous statue that was possessed at one time by the Emperor Tiberius. It's Laocoon in the 2nd book of the Aeneid. That's the most famous version of the story. He's telling the Trojans, don't let that horse inside the city. I don't trust the Greeks, even if they are bearing gifts. So Poseidon, who's on the Greek side, sends a sea monster to drag him and his sons under the water, at which point the Trojans say, oh, well, if the gods want us to take the horse in, who are we to disagree? And this is a representation, apparently in a single block of marble, but I'm not an expert on these matters. It shows the sea monster dragging them under the sea. 2nd century BC, and again, is this evidence of artistic decline? I don't think it is, but again, your opinion. More representative realism. There's the dancing faun on the left, a bronze version, and there's a boy picking a thorn out of his foot. And again, you can see that there is an emphasis on representative realism. This is meant to look like a boy who's pulling a thorn out of his foot. And it does look like a boy pulling a thorn out of his foot, doesn't it? Or if you want to... Oh yes, there of course is the sleeping hermaphrodite again. Ah, there's the one I was looking for. Now there is the Critian boy on the left. This is one of the first masterpieces of which we have knowledge from the classical period. You'll see this in the Acropolis Museum in Athens, though unfortunately the guards there won't let you photograph it unless you can get your daughter to create a slight disturbance, and then you can go and take as many pictures as you like, especially if you have a selfie stick. Of course, it is a masterpiece, but does it look like any particular human being? And the answer is not really, no. It is an ideal form of a human being, whereas the running boy on the right, 2nd century BC, Hellenistic, it is in bronze, which allows a great deal more delicacy of shaping, but there is a statue of an identifiable individual. That young man, or that boy while he was alive, could have gone up to that and said, look, that's me. And you'd have looked at the statue, you'd have looked at him and said, yes, it is. A very good likeness, isn't it? So again, What you have is a development of Greek art, not a decline of Greek art, a development of Greek art away from producing ideal forms towards portraying actual individuals. Greek science, now I showed this in our first session, the great developments of Greek mathematics all take place during and after the Hellenistic period. Euclid lived and worked in Alexandria. Eratosthenes, the chief librarian in Alexandria, he's the man who found the method of measuring the circumference of the earth. All stuff that happened in Alexandria. The Antikythera mechanism, again, probably made in Alexandria, certainly based on Alexandrian mathematics, and this is something that the classical Greeks would not remotely have been able to make. Indeed, it was something of a revelation to us because we assumed that cutting cog teeth of that fineness and precision wasn't possible until the 12th and 13th centuries AD. So there are advances in Greek technology during this period. Archimedes, probably the greatest of all the Greek mathematicians, lived in Syracuse in Sicily, and he's the man who gave us fluid mechanics. He's also the man who appears to have discovered the differential calculus, though it was forgotten and had to be rediscovered by Newton and Leibniz in the late 17th century. New philosophies. If you look at the philosophies of the classical period, it's all about ethics. It's Plato, it's Aristotle. Of course, immensely important and immensely influential, but the main philosopher of the Hellenistic period was Epicurus. I could give a whole lecture on Epicurus, indeed I once did, and I may do it again. Epicurus is the ancestor of modern science. Epicurus is the ancestor of modern utilitarianism. Epicurus is the ancestor of modern classical liberalism. It is thanks to Epicurus and his rediscovery in the 17th century that we had the Enlightenment. Now, just talking about his influence on the modern world is enough to cover his immense importance in the Hellenistic period. A sudden emphasis on individual, on personal freedom, and on human equality, and on not worrying about what the gods think of you, because the gods are not interested in you. You might as well make the best of things while you're here, and make yourself as happy as you can, and try to avoid making other people unhappy. A man who acquired a dreadful reputation because so many of the other philosophers hated him, but probably the most important philosopher of the entire Hellenistic period and of the early Roman Empire. So this is a very brief and a very patchy overview of the Hellenistic period. That long period that opened with the death of Alexander and ended, it's hard to say when it ended, but as I said, it is not a retreat from the great age of Greek civilization. It is not a decline. It is not a time of second-class achievement. It is an extension of classical Greece. It is a time when much that you find in classical Greece was brought to complete fruition, and it was an immensely diverse and vibrant, and within the limits of the pre-modern period, an immensely wealthy civilization, well worth studying in itself, not at all to be despised. Now all I can do is give an introduction, a very brief and truncated introduction, but does that work as an introduction?